So I'd like to welcome everyone today to launch of the Dublin Economic Monitor, issue 29. It's kind of quite scary for me because that means I've been involved in the Monitor 29 by 3 months, so 7 years. I mean, it's going from strength to strength. And what I love about the Economic Monitor, it's absolutely the de facto source for anything to do with Dublin's economy. And thanks to the guys in Grant Thornton and Juliet and our economic development team, it's really gone from strength to strength. And while we have paper copies of the report here today, really it's online where all the action happens, and thanks to Packed House we have a really great amount of resources in there, from all the charts, all the data, the slides. So it's dublineconomy.ie, so really keep an eye on the website, and I know you put up kind of regular blog posts and there's good stuff there as well. So thanks very much to Grant Thornton for hosting us today, and I'd like to thank Brendan as well. So it's almost tropical out there today. It's kind of unusual weather this morning, so it's great to be here in person as well, and what a beautiful view. I mean, it's just, I don't know how you guys get any work done in here just looking out at that view with the old and the new. So just to kick off, I'm going to invite the Lord Mayor, Alison Gillian, to say a few words. Thank you very much, Lord Mayor.
Good morning, everybody. Councillor Lacey, members of Dublin City Council, and all the members involved in this fantastic report. I'm really delighted to welcome you here. These offices are gorgeous. I was just shown the lovely view that you have outside there across the river. It really does give a lovely perspective to the activity in our city. I'm an early morning runner, and one of the things I love most is just seeing the city wake up and people going to work and getting out about their business. Really, there is a buzz there even for sort of 6:30, 7 in the morning. This, as Jamie said, June 2022 Dublin Economic Monitoring. It's the first event we've had for the Monitor since the onset of COVID restrictions, and it's lovely to be back face to face. Though I did have a tiny little alarm bell go off in my head this morning listening to Morning Ireland and the new variants and the creeping numbers, but we put all of that behind us and we focus on the business of this morning. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with the Dublin Economic Monitor, it's a collaboration of the 4 Dublin local authorities and designed to give up-to-date data and analysis on what is happening in the Dublin economy. And it's a really, really valuable resource for those doing business or considering doing business in Dublin. It's a quarterly publication, as Jamie mentioned, with the first edition issued back in 2015, and this morning we're launching the 29th edition. It has constantly evolved since the first issue, with the most recent major change being a partnership with Grant Thornton here and Packed House, and that started 2 years ago. With Grant Thornton, that has resulted in a welcomed broadening in the data that is tracked and the introduction of new indicators. For example, the Monitor now tracks weekly traffic patterns, restaurant bookings and job openings in Dublin, as well as the more traditional data. And this helps us gain a broader and deeper understanding in a timelier basis of what is happening across the city and the Dublin region. With Packed House, the accompanying website, dublineconomy.ie, was upgraded, and it now includes interactive downloadable data as well as articles and videos highlighting some of the key trends and issues. As Jamie said, that's where the action is online. Timely information and well-informed opinion is essential in understanding the challenges and the opportunities we face. And this is more pertinent now more than ever, as we're emerging from 2 years of fluctuating COVID-19 restrictions to face concerning inflationary environment. Energy costs, material supply costs are quite a concern, I know, for many in business at the moment. And that really hasn't been experienced in over a generation. So there is a concern that this could threaten what is relatively strong post-pandemic bounce-back employment, particularly in hospitality and in general employment across the city. Indeed, the Dublin Economic Monitor has already picked up on some of the early signs of inflation, and I welcome that Andrew Webb, Chief Economist from Grant Thornton, will be discussing some of these trends in a few minutes, and no doubt the panel will as well. Also highlighted in this edition is the importance of a well-planned urban regeneration and its importance for sustainable development. And this is something I'm particularly concerned about, and I've been trying my best with regard to Dublin City through our Dublin Development Plan to sort of ensure we get that right, because the city, it's important that it is planned. It's important that we look to the future. And while the monitor highlights that we do have a decline in rents, it is Q4 2021, a peak in completion of housing in Q1 2022. House prices still continue to rise, and I have concerns that that is impacting on our competitiveness from an affordable housing perspective. And while I'm no expert, it might also have an impact on the willingness of some employees to come back physically to the office. But as I said, I'm no expert. We do have experts here. We have a panel of representatives from South County Dublin Council, IBEC and the property industry to discuss it. So I look forward to hearing your views on that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you back to Jamie, who's our programme manager on our constantly innovating Smart Dublin programme, and he'll direct the rest of the proceedings this morning. Thank you.
That's great. That's great. Thank you very much, Lord Mayor. And I don't know how you do so much in a week. I saw you were throwing spears in Dublin Bay and back from Spain on Bloomsday. So just without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Andrew Webb, who's the Chief Economist for Grant Thornton, to just set out some of the trends we're seeing in this edition of the Monitor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Lord Mayor, thank you for the introduction, and very welcome here. And good morning, everyone in the audience. Yes, it falls to me to, I suppose, set the scene somewhat as to where the economy is and where the economy is likely to be heading next. And not an easy task when we consider this sort of uncertainty that we face in the global economy. And I mean, this is a chart that we use regularly and rely on really to set a global context for just that socio-economic political context that we're all operating in. And as we saw, pre-pandemic, tensions were ramping up. The global economy was by no means certain. And then the pandemic, if there was there's not a silver lining to the pandemic, but it did calm the socio-political scene somewhat. And now, as we all know, we're in a very unsettled, troubling context with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So that's adding to significant difficulties in economic performance. And that makes the economy much harder to predict. I don't put this chart up to criticise forecasters. I used to be one. I appreciate the difficulty in doing that. I put this up really just to reiterate that level of uncertainty. And in preparing these remarks this morning, I was looking back through the 8 editions of the Monitor that Grant Thornton and Packed House have been involved in. And it does show just how fast the context has changed, because our first edition talked about, as economists love to do, looking for the green shoots of recovery. And as we moved through the quarters, we got into hope for a sustained recovery. Then we posed the question, I think we got a bit giddy one quarter and thought, are we ready to roar, was the question we posed in that edition. And we're now into a context of consumer sentiment, business sentiment softening, and an economic context that, as we look forward, while no one's really calling a recession yet, that word is in the domain much more than it was even 6 weeks ago. So this chart, I suppose, just reiterates that uncertainty, the blue line being OECD's view of where the economy was going when they looked at it in November 19, and then the red line below looks at where they think the global economy is going in their most recent update. What I would draw through from that is obviously the decline from the pandemic, but the continuation of a gap from where they thought we were going to be and forward. So there's a sense of permanent scarring and a reduction in capacity in the economy, as well as significantly more uncertainty. And as we know, all of us look at the media and we hear this day and daily, and it's in every bulletin that inflation has taken hold, and the hot spots there are really where it's taken hold most. the UK is now up even since yesterday, with the Monetary Policy Committee in the UK suggesting that what they thought was 9% peak is now going to be 11% peak. So again, this uncertainty coming through, and really trying to think through when inflation is going to peak. And the sense now is very much one of higher for longer. So when we looked at the economy, 6 months ago, we thought team transitory would win out and that this inflation would have gone away probably by now, actually, and that the economy would be back on a fairly even keel. It became pretty evident, I suppose, with the Russia-Ukraine war and the commodity price increases and the energy cost increases, that the inflation was going to hang around for longer. So we think a peak now coming probably Q1 into Q2 next year, before a reasonably, hopefully pacey decline back to target. But again, we'll wait and see, and we'll see what the data brings in the quarters ahead. In terms of the local context, that inflation is likely to peak around 6.5%, 7% this year, before falling back, hopefully then 23 into 24. So we are still expecting growth in the economy. The EU spring forecast suggesting the growth of 2.7% this year, and slightly less than that in 23. Again, that's a revision down, but still very much in the growth space. Again, I would suppose reiterate inflation playing a part there as well. So real growth versus nominal growth has to be thought through, but that's for the policy wonks and the economists amongst us. So, but growth still on the agenda for now. Growth predicted here also, and again, just to reiterate that level of uncertainty, this is central bank forecasting when they did it in Q1, and then in the grey bars when they've done it in Q2. So still growth, but very much revision on the downside. So again, that uncertainty appearing through there. And what are we watching most at the minute in terms of where the economy is likely to head next? Consumer sentiment being key in that story. There's lots of work has been done by the likes of Blanchflower, who have tracked consumer sentiment in the US against economic performance right back to the 80s. And when you see a significant drop in consumer sentiment of around 10 points or so, you then get a recession. And we're very much back in that space now globally. And within the local economy here, we are starting to see a significant downturn in consumer sentiment. Not unexpected given the energy cost issues, and that's now coming through into food price inflation. But when KBC Bank, for example, have looked at this and asked questions about this in their consumer sentiment study, I suppose the concern is that figure of around 85% of consumers who expect to curtail their spending as a result of the higher inflation and that uncertainty. And then when you scratch that number a little bit, you see about half of that cohort expect to reduce their spending significantly. So we're starting to see that coming through in a diversion from desirable goods, the desirable goods being, I suppose, clothing, holidays, home renovations, and we're starting to see people having to pivot that spending into the essential items of heat, food, power, etc. And we are starting to see some of that change come through in the most recent MasterCard spending. But for now, Q1, I suppose, was telling that story of an economy that was still coming out of that pent-up demand phase, and there was still a journey to go there and some of that. But as we track it through, we're starting to see that changing context come through. So there is evidence of a more jittery consumer. There's also significant volatility in business optimism, and I suppose, given the breadth of sectors and activity that happens in the economy, this wouldn't be unexpected. We're starting to see retail sentiment dip fairly dramatically, given how it's so linked to the consumer. But we're starting to see as well construction sentiment on the turn. But in other parts of the economy, elements of manufacturing, we're still seeing quite strong activity. So overall, there's a business sentiment turn, but not to the same extent as the consumer. So we watch that again with interest in our tracking of what comes next. That, I should say, is Bank of Ireland's Business Pulse Index. It's one we would look at quite readily. It's one of the key leading indicators that we track, given its frequency, its monthly issue. And then within the monitor, for some Dublin Economic, Dublin Council type insights, the business activity from S&P's purchasing managing indices. Anything over 50 here, so anything above the line of 50 is in growth phase, and anything below 50 is in decline. So I suppose we draw positivity from the fact that we're still in growth territory in the sentiment, and we just noticed then in the most recent data that turn downwards, and we watch that, as I say, with increasing interest to see where the economy's heading. We're also watching, and we're grateful to Indeed for the job postings data that they provide. The story's a positive one in the labour market when you think about what it could have been, and how the labour market was protected through the worst of the pandemic. Again, coming through in the job postings data is that job listings in total are above pre-pandemic levels, but in the last month or so, we are now starting to see a tail off in new listings, so a bit of a softening there in the labour market. But labour market has been a bright spot in the last year or so. So for us, the key watch list over the next 6 to 9 months, interest rates and inflation, obviously. So interest rates are baked in for an increase. That's coming down the tracks. What that means then for consumer spending and business debt, it increases the price of that. So that could put a bit of a brake on the economy, which is the intention when the bank does it. A labour market that's tightening. There's a challenge in finding labour at the minute, and whether or not that sustains or whether or not then employers start to hold back on recruitment plans is something we're tracking. Consumer spend and footfall would be very much tied to city centre vitality and how many people come back to offices, and that hybrid versus flexible versus home working story. All that passing trade that used to happen at lunch and after work still to be regained, and if it is, that will obviously support so much activity around the city. Government supports then, obviously there were the government supports that protected businesses through the pandemic, but we're now into a new era of government supports with the Just Transition type funds and other funds coming down from the EU to support business development and business growth. And then trade flows as well, another key element for us as when we think about north-south trade and south-north trade and the protocol. So again, that's a very mixed picture at the minute and still to be worked through. And just to end on, I suppose, a bit of a snapshot, I didn't overly dwell on what's in the monitor because I would urge you to go online and read the copy you have and pull the stories out yourselves. But in terms of some of the key elements there, I think competitiveness is really the main issue that we're facing in Dublin at the minute. And competitiveness is good, and it's a really attractive place. And the number of businesses that have post-Brexit moved from GB into Dublin, I think it was in the high 30s the last time I checked it in terms of financial services. So there's really positive story in terms of what the city is doing in its ability to attract new activity. The key economic indicators, as I say, I would urge you to look at that, the monitor, but there's some significant positives that we've tracked through. What I would say, just to return to that competitiveness piece, I've recently become aware of the theory, which is the housing theory of everything, which basically suggests that every economic challenge an economy faces, competitiveness, labour market issues, whatever they might be, all comes back to quality of life and having the right affordable housing in the right place. And I think that's a good point on which to end and look forward to what the panel has to discuss when we think about the articles in the monitor about the development and the regeneration of the city. So on that, I'll stop and very much look forward to hearing about that in the panel. Thank you.
That's great, Andrew. Thanks very much for that. And one thing I love about the monitor is just having access to all that data in one place, and the traditional data sets that we've always relied on, but the new ones that working with yourselves and the likes of MasterCard, we can get our finger on the pulse. I think is really important. So each monitor, as you know, has all that data, but also we have a couple of special articles every edition, and the theme for this edition is looking at urban regeneration. So I've got a couple of the authors of the articles today, and we're going to invite them up to take part in a panel discussion just looking at the urban regeneration and where we're going there with some exciting projects. So I'm going to invite the panelists up to sit down here, and then I'll do a quick introduction. That's great. So we have Danny McCoy, who's the Chief Executive of IBEC, I think since 2006 or in 2009, is it, Danny?
9, yeah.
2009, great. So you've been through lots of cycles of economic growth and decline, so we have great perspective, and thanks for your article today. We also got Margaret Fleming as well. Margaret has over 30 years experience as a chartered surveyor, and we all know you probably from JLL, but you have a lot of other exciting roles and executive director roles. I know you're involved with Hibernia REIT, amongst others. And then we also have Mick as well, Mick from South Dublin. And I know, Mick, you're head of land use, planning and transportation. Just sounds a very exciting role. But I know you have a lot of experience from London, working with the Mayor of London, and you've been involved in projects like the Olympics and big regeneration projects across London as well. So the project you're kind of leading in partnership with Dublin City Council and South Dublin City Edge. A lot of people have seen some of it in the article today, but maybe give us a little of an idea in terms of the vision for that project and where you hope to take it. And I know we're looking very much at the long term here and future-proofing the city.
Yeah, no problem. And just want to say thanks to Andrew. That was really interesting. And I think the bit that I took from that most was obviously, this isn't new to anybody in this room, is the economy is always in a state of flux and will always change. And the bit I'd add to it from working in the public sector is politics is always in a state of flux as well, and constantly in a state of change, and our priorities change. And I think when you put both of those two things together, the economy and the political environment, it actually it can have a significant impact on how our cities are shaped and how they come forward and how they're developed over time. So we need to respond to that. But at the same time, I think if you're too responsive, I think ultimately you can fail in terms of what you're trying to achieve in terms of regeneration. So like you say, I've had several years of experience, 18, 19 years of experience in London. So like looking at a lot of that regen stuff, the big lesson that I would have there is setting an ambitious yet realistic vision for a place that you can get people behind and get stakeholders bought into over time. So what City Edge is it's not a today or tomorrow place that gets regenerated. It's a kind of a looking at the long-term pipeline of brownfield land in the Dublin region, 5-6 years from now. And it's about 700 hectares of land just inside the M50. If you're coming in on the N7 and you're driving down the Nace Road, it's all of that industrial land on either side of there. And kind of as soon as you cross over the M50 up towards Inchicore, Ballyfermot down to kind of Walkinstown. So it's a huge part of the city. And it used to be the edge of the city, but now it's obviously, the city's grown out around that. Today, there's about 25,000 people who work there, generating 1.9 billion of GVA for the Irish economy. So it's actually an incredibly important, and I'm sure, Danny, you'll come on to this yourself, it's an incredibly important part of the city. You can't just expect, we'll just put a load of homes in there and Dublin will continue to operate as it does today. It won't. So actually a big part for us is thinking about how we can intensify the land, because it is 15, 20 minutes from the city. You can get a kind of a 15-minute city principle, walking, cycling into the city, but we've got to find a way to keep business there, but to intensify it. So we see the potential of that area as up to 40,000 homes, up to 70,000 people working there, so that's up from 25,000 people today. And with the potential, if you realise that over a 30, 40-year period, potential for about 13 billion of GVA for the Irish economy. So for Ireland Inc., it makes huge sense. But the piece I mentioned at the outset is sustained political and economic and investment support. And to do that, you need a vision for the place that people can think, that's a place that we want people to live in. We think business will want to work there. We think people will want to work there. And to do that, you've got to have a really good and convincing story about placemaking and the provision of open space. And if you go out there today and you look around, you think, I'm not really buying this. And actually, we talked to several landowners and developers out there who have got planning permission. There's 4,000 homes of planning permission out there. You might see some of those built, but in reality, people aren't going to invest because they don't have that they don't have that belief in that longer term vision. If you build it, they won't come at the moment. But so what we've tried to do through the framework is set a vision around place. Importantly, infrastructure. So there's a huge deficit of infrastructure out there at the moment, from the nuts and bolts stuff under the ground, sewers and foul, all the way up to lack of open space and lack of community facilities. And I say lack, it's not a lack today, but it is a lack for the type of place that we want to create. So through the framework, we've identified all of those pieces of kit we know are needed, but to get those, a lot of this is big investment from the state, and the public sector having to align itself to prioritise, upgrading the 9B sewer, a new train station on the Lewis line, train station coming out of Euston, assembling land to deliver big pieces of open space. So these are big challenges, and working with the local businesses in the area. The state's going to have to go in and probably assemble some land here to facilitate infrastructure delivery, to promote, there's limited state land ownership in the area. So again, we're going to have to take a proactive role in acquiring land to facilitate housing delivery and kind of piecing all of that together. So the framework that it's gone through Dublin City Council earlier in the week, went through South Dublin Council. It's not a statutory plan yet, but it's been through both councils. It's on our website. You can go on, it'll be on the website in the next couple of days, www.cityedge.ie. All of this information is on there. You can go on and see what we're trying to promote for the place. But kind of what I kind of come back to is that great to have a vision, great to know what needs to be achieved, but ultimately this takes bold, long-term decision-making, because you won't realise return on investment straight away. So the state's got to back this up with some meaningful long-term decision-making, which moves beyond, short-term political or economic cycles. So
that's great. I mean, and also the City Edge. I mean, it's great vision. There's great visuals. I mean, very positive feedback on the launch. I mean, Danny, what was the experience from your reaction from businesses, your members?
Yeah, I think it's very positive. The vision is there because everybody realises that in an urban context, density is very correlated with productivity and competitiveness, and particularly in the way the world has moved towards service-based activity and intangible assets, which are intellectual property effectively. So all of that dynamism requires that density. So the project's very exciting. I guess agree with Mick here is that it has to be long term, but there will, as he said, the start be flux. And so one of the dangers is that you decrease a current economic activity and the length of gap, because you end up if we don't buy into that and stay with it, there's the likelihood, and we see this before the great financial crash, that you take down an activity waiting for something to come, and there's a fallow period in there. So even for the businesses that are in that area right now, just even fixing up their properties at the moment, will they reinvest in the building? So I think we need to see them not as landowners, but actually what they're doing on that land as well. I think it's important in the equation. So consultation, but from the business side, it's a very positive dynamics, the way to go.
Yeah, I mean, in your article, you talked about the success of Docklands as a massive regeneration, and that delivered a lot of value to the city.
It certainly did. So I mean, it definitely these visions, and like just here is a vision as well. But obviously, watching, you need the wisdom of Solomon. But if you get the timing wrong on the economic cycle, we very small things in Dublin is, for the want of a wrecking ball, some of the kind of convention space would have been gone. In a matter of timing, when you look at the Burlington just as one example. So that's always going to be the danger, that if you get the timing of this wrong, or you don't have the kind of ducks in a row, you could actually see for half a generation things go backwards. I guess that's just something, maybe we talk about the economics is going on at the moment. We may well be just at the preface of a different economic space here.
Absolutely. And Margaret, what would your views be? And you've been through a lot of these cycles, and you've seen a lot of big projects in your career. Where would you see this one?
I think that the City Edge project is exactly as described there by Mick. It's a superb thing, and if we had more of it 40, 50 years ago of that kind of good planning, we might have, even to be controversial, even better spaces than we have in the docks. More livable spaces. So I think it's absolutely essential. But I'm probably the one person who's going to shout fire while not actually clearing the room. To me, the challenge, over all those decades, having obviously started very young in property, I've seen various crashes of all sorts, and I think perhaps what I would love to see more of is conversation between the public sector and the private sector. I think that has diminished quite a lot in the last few years, and probably not aided by the pandemic as well. But and by the mistrust from the crash and all the rest. But I really think we need to start leaving that behind us, because the beast that delivers the actual buildings sits at the top of this enormous pyramid of failure and wasted activity and little bits of success and things falling by the wayside and bankruptcy. And by the time what you see at the top of people actually delivering is a far more delicate animal, I think, than a lot of people appreciate. And I think that delivery mechanism is under ferocious pressure at the moment. I don't need to read all the stuff about inflation, but like where I'm sitting now with, development on one side, but lending on the other side, when you're sitting there looking at handing out actual money that you want to actually get back and looking at the sensitivities on it, it's all become very delicate. And certainly a challenge for City Edge will be high density, which obviously, or medium density, maybe high density, which is good for sustainability and is essential. But high density might mean no density. And so the challenge, I would say, for the planners and the building industry together is to see, how do we really push forward delivery in the middle of a housing crisis? Like we can do the long-term planning, but we also need to deliver. We're 40, 50, 60, 70,000 houses behind today, and it's getting worse. And I don't know about you, but there is social unrest brewing around this, and correctly so. There's emigration starting. I'm sure you must all have anecdotal stories about people who are leaving the country. So I would challenge everybody in this room and people in my industry to just see what can be delivered as fast as humanly possible in the next 2 years in parallel with the long-term planning.
And Mick, how would you respond to that, the short, medium, long-term challenges and aligning those if you can?
Yeah, I think I don't disagree. We hear it every day, the challenge for immediate delivery of housing. And I think I'd probably just respond with, even in South Dublin alone, we've got a number of big strategic development zones where we're actively trying to get delivery going. I think in a place like City Edge, I think you will see some small-scale housing delivery in the next couple of years. But ultimately, there's deficits of infrastructure. The 9B sewers, that capacity that needs to be upgraded. I think if we focus all of our attention on the here and now today and what we can eke out of that, whilst really important, I think we'll just be in the same position again and again and again. I think we do need to take the time and take investment decisions now that will, in 5 or 6 years' time, when we get to, when housing is still a crisis in 5 or 6 years' time, we've then got lands like the City Edge coming on stream at that point. So I think, absolutely there's scope for housing at City Edge in the early years, but actually this is something that we do need to think about longer term as a strategic land bank for the whole city. So we're at risk of pushing everything out if we just think too short term. So that'd be mine.
Yeah. I think also the collaboration across the two local authorities is really important as well as part of the project.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a steering group co-chaired by the two chief execs, and we've got all manner of state agencies, Irish Water, NTA, TII, etc., LDA on that board to kind of make sure that, because we all know the infrastructure and aligning Irish Water's investment programme, short and medium term investment programmes are going to be key to and the NTAs, etc. So like all of aligning that state agency on the infrastructure is critical with both local authorities. Yeah.
And Danny, what are your thoughts just in terms of Margaret's comments there?
Well, it's hard to disagree with the scale of the housing challenge. And there's certainly people are always emigrating. I'm not sure where they're going to emigrate to, given the global context. But perhaps what you're really saying is they're going to where they'll find a basic need, which is housing. So even though the economic prospects are really strong here, relative, and come back to that in a moment, this is the huge challenge. But it's a challenge which actually echoes what the Monitor has been saying for the last 7 years. Those highlights that you handed out at the start actually came true, right? In green shoots of recovery, how much more recovery does Ireland need, or were you thinking 7 years ago, in terms of economic activity, in terms of incomes, in terms of the resources, if properly channeled, to deliver what we need. So, the Monitor is tracking really well, I think, and even in the latest edition, it's capturing a feature which is fairly unique to Ireland, is the Great Resignation is not happening in Ireland. Right? People mean say the Great Resignation globally. They're talking about people leaving the labour force. They're not talking about leaving individual businesses. That obviously is occurring here in Ireland, but we've seen, and Dublin is experiencing it as well, is the labour force is increasing. And that's a big challenge. We know there's 2.6 million people in the labour force now, remarkably nearly 200,000 people more than at the start of the pandemic, but perfectly consistent with the economic growth that's been recorded over the last 3 years. The Irish economy has gone up by 25% in economic activity through the last 3 years. That's why more people are at work. That's why more people are getting their living. So that makes it all the more challenging, the deficit on that kind of basic hierarchy. I know I'm getting old and grumpy, but as I walk past coffee shops and I see young people who are, virile and gym bunnies and so on and selling each other coffee, which is great, but simultaneously they don't have a house. You're kind of going, I'm turning into a communist, Can we not give people shovels and build your own home? So we're definitely getting the signals and mismatches here, which at one level is great. The affluence and the capacity, but we're missing, I should agree with Margaret, we're missing that interface between the public and private in a way that's quite dramatic. And the other piece is, clearly of that 2.6 million people now in our labour force, 1 million of them are in the private sector, and we've got the same scale of public sector when we had 1.6 million in the labour force. That should be an indication of some of the capacity in our systems to be able to deliver for the scale and wealth of our society.
Yeah, Margaret.
And well, if you want the people out with shovels, we as a group should be, what was the name of the sewer?
The 9B sewer.
The 9B is what they should be doing.
Yeah.
It seems to me that there's a kind of that the good stuff is going on. You're talking to Irish Water and everything, but politically, there's an enormous volume of words going about the place. But if we need a sewer built, that should be built like tomorrow morning. We shouldn't be putting in, sorry, Owen's going to say cycle lanes to Owen, I better not. But I mean, whatever, sorry, Owen, whatever we're spending money on, whatever we're spending money on in road, anything else, there's a road near me in North Farnham that's spent whatever, but we should stop all that and build the sewer. If we could join up the things that we need and put the resources where we need them, build that, and then be innovative on the type of housing that we allow. Looking at you've worked on. Are there other forms of housing, tiny housing? Even the thing there that Glanvey are talking about now, but just changing 2 regs to be able to build Stony Batter, to be able to build sort of lower rise, high density, medium density housing. There must be somewhere on the city edge that we could put a big load of that and get people into it, which is actually nice. That's housing that people will pay a fortune to live in. So what I'd love to see is us all sitting down together with the industry with a bit of trust, and there's nobody really cleaning up on this anymore. They're at risk, if anything, and trying to be a bit innovative on the format of housing, on doing something a bit different without compromising the sustainability requirements. And then for that to be public, so that people, if we need a sewer, we should all be talking about the sewer. Yeah. And let that be the number one political priority. That'll make good election literature.
Just one comment on that. I think the bit that gets this public sector grinding itself into a halt is the decision-making processes, a lot of which have been, born out of the crash and maybe ill thought through investment decisions historically, but I think in some ways we've gone probably too far the other way, and empowering public sector, at the right level, empowering people to be able to make quicker decisions, because we've, not City Edge, we're not at that point yet, but we've got other projects in South Dublin where you feel like you're just re-justifying yourself over and over and over and spending more money on people like Grant Thornton and KPMG to do another business case, and then the next iteration of the same business case, and you're like, we're trying to build a sewer to get housing built, so let's just do it quicker. There doesn't need to be that level of bureaucracy around it. So I think people do know what's needed. It's sometimes I think the decision making is just too slow.
Yeah, so let's build sewers before we can get the houses.
It'll take building a sewer through the city. It's a complicated piece, so it's going to take time to build it. But the decision to do it shouldn't take so long.
Yeah. Maybe just thinking about the vision of City Edge and selling that vision. I mean, people get inspired by what's happened elsewhere. I know we talked about Docklands, but you looked at a lot of really cool international projects. I mean, what kind of projects inspire you? I know you got experience in London, maybe for the panelists. What kind of projects inspire you and think would work well in Dublin?
I think the 2 or 3 that we used as quite good examples were King's Cross in London, which was led by, that went through multiple cycles and got off the traps and fell away, and JLL were, and then fell and came back, and then, ultimately a landowner working with the state brought forward an amazing regeneration scheme at King's Cross. So, and built on 15-minute city principles, that kind of not massive tall buildings, but really good density in place. Nordhaven was another great one in Copenhagen, Oosthaven in Denmark. So, and actually what you see consistently throughout those is not just, well, we'll write a plan as the public sector and we'll leave the private sector to sort it out. It's ultimately the state playing a really active role in supporting infrastructure investment, knowing that if they invest in that and then the private sector comes in behind and does the delivery, ultimately the state wins because of longer term GVA benefits and so on. But I think there's that close collaboration between, look, if the state takes an investment position, then it will regain it in time. Whereas I think sometimes that can be seen as a bit of a dirty word in some ways, like as it moving away from this kind of too much of a state investment. Oh, well, the state can't pay for something that the private sector should be doing. So I think that for me is a really important thing that we've learned from. You can do great placemaking, but it's actually the nuts and bolts of unlocking it that requires big state longevity in it.
Absolutely. And Danny, what kind of projects, like models, have you seen internationally?
Well, actually, the King's Cross one was the one when you asked that question, I was thinking of, because I actually lived and worked in that area in the 90s. But not having lived in it, I think, not having lived in it, I suppose, that I physically see it, so it is very impressive. But actually, in truth, I really like what's happening along the Grand Canal as you move down, even from Leeson Street Bridge, and the placemaking along the way, all the way down to the Grand Canal. So it's clearly now demonstrable when a city can get into modernity and start to mix that kind of density. Long time ago, Ireland would be going aspirationally. Like, we have the stuff now. That's the point. We just have enough of it. I'm still obsessing about the sewer. I'm definitely thinking we're all in the sewer, but some of us are digging it. And I think we'll attribute that to Oscar Wilde, as we do in Ireland. We can make it up. But I think that's the practicalities of us coming together collectively now. But we need a situation analysis. And I think that's the situation analysis in terms of the tangible about the housing and so on can be agreed. But what's not agreed is the economic. And for the last decade, the denial of Ireland's economic story has led to some of these problems, because demonstrably the money's been in our system. And yet we have a whole nonsense of GNP, GDP, GNI star. Like that particular debate was not costless. I think it was hugely costly, because we failed to appreciate the reality of the incomes that came into the economy during that phase, the quality of the jobs. There's no way a country could do the kind of 1.6 million labour force to 2.6 million if this wasn't actually a phenomenon. But the modalities of the precision on the measures and so on was frankly not just a nonsense, but was incredibly costly. I think that's one of the big issues that history will show about the economic community during this phase. Couldn't even get the situation analysis right.
That reminds me of the thing about regulations as well, because a funny thing happened, like the whole country fell off a cliff in 2008, and the property industry really went west. So that at a time that a whole lot of new regulation was coming in, because at the end of that boom, the planners, quite rightly in some cases, escalated all of the regulations up to really, really, really world-class standards. And the property industry was too busy, dying to do anything about it. And I think that needs another look now. So even things like the renovation of over the shop and upper floors, I mean, one of my involvements is with the Ivy Trust, and the red flats there down around, but the Kevin Street flats are the densest development in the entire city, anywhere. but if you come to renovate one of those, the cost with modern regulations. So what I'm saying is we need to look at the regulations and make them a little more sensible for listed buildings and for over the flat and so on. Because I think, I was quoting to somebody earlier on, it was my mother-in-law who said to me, never attribute to malice what can be fully explained by stupidity. And I think people think that people are holding things vacant with all sorts of Machiavellian, they're really, really, really not. Like, a huge amount of vacant property is in the wrong hands. If you did it up, it wouldn't be worth the money you spent on it. You can't get the fire officer, you can't get the disability cert. You're not even in the property business. So a huge amount of vacancy. I think there's a terrible tendency for everyone to attribute everything to malice. It really is not so. And I think if we could sort of drop that narrative a bit, I've looked at across loan books at an awful lot of people who lost an awful lot of money. It's far easier to lose money on property than it is to make it, but they never make the headlines. So I think if we could just drop some of that narrative and just get into a slightly more trusting kind of an environment where we can look at regulations and how to actually get things done. And other countries who've done that successfully, so that'd be my appeal really, which I think you're open to.
Yeah. Well, listen, we're just coming to the end of the panel session, but maybe Mick, would you want to just give a bit of a call to action for City Edge? I mean, what do you hope to see happen next? I mean, for everyone here, how can everyone help?
What we do, firstly, go on the web. We've got, in the next week or so, sorry, we were waiting for it to get through final approvals. But we've got a set of priority actions for us. There's about 24 of them on there. Top of the list are things like 9B sewer, 2 new train stations, etc. So for us, actually, for us, central to it is really about longer term decision making, like getting the Department of Housing and Planning, which we can look at over there, getting deeper to take decisions about investing in these things, not on maybe on an inflation rate of 11% today, but actually recognising the longer term and not having us to do repeated sensitivity tests on all of this stuff. So for me, it would be streamlining decision making is about longer term investment and doing that on our priority projects, which we know. So
that's great. I'd like to thank the panelists for a fascinating discussion and some controversy as well. So thank you very much, everyone. I'm just going to welcome Owen Keegan, our Chief Executive of Dublin City Council, just to close out the session.
Thanks very much, Jamie. Where are we now? Right, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you all very much for talking out here this morning. A special thank you to the Lord Mayor for making time in a very busy schedule to be with us and for opening words. I want to reiterate our sincere thanks to Grant Thornton and Pact House for their work in producing the Monitor, and especially in hosting this morning's event. And what a wonderful location to be hosting an event discussing the Dublin economy. I think those of you who've been with the Monitor over a number of years will say that I think the quality of the publication and the website, it's really improved since we entered into a partnership with Grant Thornton and Pact House over 2 years ago. I want to acknowledge our panel, Mick Mulhern, Margaret Fleming and Danny McCoy, and our moderator, Jamie Cudden, for the debate on the opportunities provided by urban regeneration. I think you'll agree with me that the City Edge project is undoubtedly a very ambitious project, and the potential to create or make a significant contribution to economic and community development in the Dublin region in a sustainable manner. And I think while it's a good example of good long-term sustainable planning, I have a certain sympathy with what Margaret is saying, is that I think there is a need for much better dialogue between public agencies and the property development sector. I'm very conscious of the fact that in the city at the moment, where we're requiring everybody to build apartments, up until recently it was just impossible to finance them because you couldn't sell them to people on average incomes. And with recent changes in interest rates and rent caps, I mean, let's say that I'm not against the rent caps, but I think we've managed to make even build-to-let development unfinanceable, which is an outstanding achievement in a period of extraordinary housing demand. So I think there is a need for better engagement, and I think well-intended regulation, which I have to say we're leaders at, has unintended consequences that we really do need to, we pay a very high price for. So look, I'm really delighted that we've been able to hold an in-person event for the first time. It must have been 2 years, and clearly a lot has changed for the better over the last 2 years, and a lot of that is reflected in the indicators in the monitor. I mean, we picked up on those earlier today, so a lot of very positive stuff. But I'd also, I suppose, echo the warning in the monitor that there are mounting headwinds, especially accelerating inflation, rising interest rates, supply chain constraints, and considerable uncertainty regarding the world economy. And I'm looking around the audience, very few of you were working in the early 1970s like I was. But anybody who was working there will know that high inflation has profound and at times very pernicious impacts on the real economy. I kind of feel we're just sleepwalking into high inflation without any regard. And it's much easier to get into a high inflationary scenario than it is to get out of it. So I think it remains to be seen if the traditional resilience and underlying strength of the Dublin economy will be sufficient to see us through a few difficult times ahead. So a final thank you, I think, to Juliet from our own development unit for her work in putting the whole monitor, overseeing the publication of the monitor. And thank you again for coming here.